In January 1943, the southeastern part of England lived under the constant threat of new air raids. Since late 1942, German aviation had reduced the intensity of attacks on London, but the coast of Kent remained vulnerable. Among its hills and old stone farms lived Elizabeth Carroll, a senior nurse at the military hospital near Maidstone. Her life, at first glance, seemed no different from that of hundreds of other women who had replaced men since the beginning of the war. Long shifts, cold corridors, a shortage of medicine, the evacuation of the wounded. No one imagined that this quiet, self-contained woman was capable of an act that almost no one of her time would ever know about. Elizabeth had been born in 1909 to a school teacher and a homemaker. By the time the war began, she was 30, with enough experience to lead a small ward. When the massive bombings began in September 1940, the hospital received the first wave of civilian casualties. That was when she first saw how an entire street could disappear overnight. From that moment, she almost never left the hospital, and with each passing month, her sense of duty consumed everything personal. By early 1943, the front lines had moved far beyond the English Channel, yet the shadows of war still lay across the coast. In the air, there was exhaustion. People continued tending gardens to feed themselves, repairing homes that had survived the blasts, and every morning looking to the sky as if expecting the next alarm. Newspapers spoke of the victory at Stalingrad and the turning tide of the war, but in British villages where every window was covered to hide the light, tension still ruled daily life. Elizabeth had grown used to news of downed planes. Her brother, a Royal Air Force mechanic, had been killed in 1941, and since then any mention of air battles filled her with quiet pain. Perhaps that pain became the root of her later decision. After his death, she rarely spoke of him, but each day, walking past wards full of burned pilots, she saw his features in other young faces, exhausted, disfigured, barely alive. By late January 1943, German reconnaissance aircraft appeared more often over Kent. Sometimes they dropped single bombs. More often, they just observed. That winter, several enemy planes were shot down over the Channel, and locals found wreckage along the beaches. It was then that Elizabeth first heard rumors that one of the German pilots, who had miraculously survived a crash, had not been found. People said he had parachuted into the marshes and likely died there. For most, it was just another wartime story. For Elizabeth, it sounded different. She knew the marshland between Appledore and Lydd, a maze of wet ground and hidden paths that could conceal a person for days. She had been born in those parts and knew the old smugglers' trails. Perhaps it was curiosity, or something deeper, that made her take a detour one evening on her way home from the hospital. Among the frozen branches, she noticed faint footprints, human ones. Britons of that time were raised in strict loyalty. Any assistance to the enemy was considered treason. Even sheltering a prisoner by accident could mean arrest. Yet Elizabeth said nothing. She did not report the tracks leading toward an abandoned mill long since empty. Perhaps even she did not understand why she stayed silent. But in those years, when death and fear were constant companions, compassion sometimes outweighed reason. A few days later, the hospital received word that the missing German pilot had not been found and was presumed drowned. For Elizabeth, it was confirmation that no one would search again. She continued her work as usual, but the thought of those footprints lingered. That winter in Kent was cold, but without heavy snow. The nights were long and silent. Elizabeth began returning home later, saying she had extra shifts. Her small house on the edge of Selmond Village was old, with low ceilings and a fireplace where she sometimes warmed her kettle on the coals. No one yet knew that by February, that quiet house would become a refuge for a man officially declared her enemy. In the first days of February, 1943, the weather in southeastern England remained harsh. Cold winds from the Channel brought fine drizzle that turned roads into sticky clay. For the villagers of Kent, it meant isolation once again, rare food deliveries, power outages, and the constant need to save fuel. Elizabeth Carroll followed her usual route home from the hospital, but now it included a quiet detour, a turn toward the marshland where she had seen footprints weeks before. Her medical intuition told her that a person caught there in winter could not survive without help, yet something within her refused to let go of the thought. In those times, such reflections were dangerous. Any sign of sympathy toward the enemy could destroy a life and reputation. But Elizabeth no longer thought in terms of sides. Each day in the hospital, she witnessed human suffering stripped of nationality or language. Beneath uniforms and insignia, she saw the same thing, a frail human body, exhausted by pain and fear. One day, during a rare morning off duty, she went to the marsh with a basket, pretending to gather firewood. The silence was heavy. Frost clung to the branches, and the ground crackled underfoot. At the old mill, where she expected only decay, she noticed a faint wisp of smoke too weak to be seen from afar, but visible to an attentive eye. She stopped. Her heart beat unevenly. At that moment, she understood the man presumed dead was alive. She did not enter the mill. She called to no one. She simply left the basket at the entrance, a little bread, bandages, an old flask of water, and walked away. That evening, she sat by her fireplace for a long time, wondering if she had done the right thing. In the hospital, she had learned to save lives without discrimination. There, humanity came before allegiance. But here, on her own soil, that instinct had turned into a crime. The following days passed quietly. She saw no more smoke, but one day noticed a small stone carefully placed where she had left the basket, a silent sign of gratitude. She took it as confirmation. The man was alive and knew that someone nearby had chosen not to betray him. Rumors began to circulate in the village. Farmers spoke of strange noises near the old mill at night, as if someone were moving planks or lighting a fire. An elderly watchman claimed to have seen a shadow among the trees. By March, however, the talk subsided. People had learned to explain everything by the war, and the war explained everything. Elizabeth went on with her work. In the hospital, she remained calm, precise, efficient, just as before. But in the evenings, she extinguished her lamps earlier than usual and listened to the silence outside. Beyond the window, the wind moaned, and sometimes the distant sound of aircraft rolled through the sky. In that cold, anxious February, she understood that she had taken on a secret duty, one that could never be spoken of. March 1943 brought long-awaited warmth to Kent. Snow melted, the marshes exhaled damp mist, and local farmers returned to their fields. In the village of Selmond, life slowly regained its rhythm despite the war. Spring compelled people to continue living. Elizabeth Carroll also seemed to return to her routine. Yet her house on the edge of the village carried a tension invisible to others, a silence filled with vigilance. By late February, she had gone back to the marsh and found the mill empty. Inside lay traces of human presence, scraps of cloth, ashes from a small fire, a strip of bandage. She realized that the man she had once helped was still nearby. That night, walking along the muddy road home, she felt as though someone followed her. When she turned, there was no one. She told herself it was only fear. But a few days later, returning from a late shift, she saw a shadow near her gate. In the dim light stood a man in a worn pilot's uniform. What happened next was something Elizabeth would never describe in words. She remembered only the cold air, the exhaustion in his eyes, and the brief motion of his hand, a plea for silence. She knew he was an enemy, yet in that instant she did not see a soldier, only a wounded man with nowhere to go. He could barely stand. She let him in without speaking, without hesitation, simply because she could not do otherwise. Her house stood apart from the road, its windows covered with heavy curtains, invisible from outside. In the cellar, where coal had once been stored, she prepared a small shelter. It was damp and cold, but safe. The following weeks passed in cautious routine. Elizabeth brought food, water, and medicine. She knew that by doing this, she risked not only her life, but everything she possessed. While newspapers wrote of Allied victories in North Africa, she was hiding beneath her own floorboards a man who, months before, had dropped bombs on British cities. The contradiction haunted her every night. Yet the fear of punishment was weaker than her conviction that life could not be spared selectively. In the village, people began noticing that Elizabeth was buying more food than before. A neighbor joked that she must be feeding every cat in the district. Elizabeth smiled politely, offering no explanation. Her reputation as a calm and reliable woman protected her better than any lie could. In the cellar, beneath layers of blankets, the German pilot slowly regained his strength. Elizabeth avoided thinking about what would happen next. She had no plan. To hand him over meant confessing her own guilt. To release him meant placing both their lives in danger. And so, in her modest house, on the edge of Selmond, a fragile boundary was drawn between duty and compassion. Outside, the war continued as before. But inside, there was only silence. A silence heavy enough to remind her that one mistake, one sound, could end everything. March 1943 brought long-awaited warmth to Kent. Snow melted, the marshes exhaled damp mist, and local farmers returned to their fields. In the village of Selmond, life slowly regained its rhythm despite the war. Spring compelled people to continue living. Elizabeth Carroll also seemed to return to her routine. Yet her house on the edge of the village carried a tension invisible to others, a silence filled with vigilance. By late February, she had gone back to the marsh and found the mill empty. Inside lay traces of human presence, scraps of cloth, ashes from a small fire, a strip of bandage. She realized that the man she had once helped was still nearby. That night, walking along the muddy road home, she felt as though someone followed her. When she turned, there was no one. She told herself it was only fear. But a few days later, returning from a late shift, she saw a shadow near her gate. In the dim light stood a man in a worn pilot's uniform. What happened next was something Elizabeth would never describe in words. She remembered only the cold air, the exhaustion in his eyes, and the brief motion of his hand, a plea for silence. She knew he was an enemy, yet in that instant she did not see a soldier, only a wounded man with nowhere to go. He could barely stand. She let him in without speaking, without hesitation, simply because she could not do otherwise. Her house stood apart from the road, its windows covered with heavy curtains, invisible from outside. In the cellar, where coal had once been stored, she prepared a small shelter. It was damp and cold, but safe. The following weeks passed in cautious routine. Elizabeth brought food, water, and medicine. She knew that by doing this, she risked not only her life, but everything she possessed. While newspapers wrote of Allied victories in North Africa, she was hiding beneath her own floorboards a man who, months before, had dropped bombs on British cities. The contradiction haunted her every night. Yet the fear of punishment was weaker than her conviction that life could not be spared selectively. In the village, people began noticing that Elizabeth was buying more food than before. A neighbor joked that she must be feeding every cat in the district. Elizabeth smiled politely, offering no explanation. Her reputation as a calm and reliable woman protected her better than any lie could. In the cellar, beneath layers of blankets, the German pilot slowly regained his strength. Elizabeth avoided thinking about what would happen next. She had no plan. To hand him over meant confessing her own guilt. To release him meant placing both their lives in danger. And so, in her modest house on the edge of Selmond, a fragile boundary was drawn between duty and compassion. Outside, the war continued as before. But inside, there was only silence. A silence heavy enough to remind her that one mistake, one sound, could end everything. May 1943 brought unstable warmth to Kent and a rare sense of relief. After months of air raid sirens, the sky above the coast seemed calmer, though the distant echo of explosions still reminded everyone that the war was far from over. With each passing day, fewer severely wounded arrived at the hospital, and Elizabeth Carroll felt, for the first time in years, a faint resemblance of rest. Yet in her house, silence did not mean peace. It had become a form of vigilance, an unending tension that waited for resolution. The pilot she had been hiding for more than 3 months had nearly recovered. His wounds had closed, his breathing had steadied, and he could now move without her help. His presence had blended into the rhythm of the house, the faint sound of footsteps in the cellar, the smell of damp linen, the hidden trace of someone else's existence. Elizabeth did not know his name and did not wish to. The less she knew, the safer they both were. To her, he remained not a man, but a fragile symbol, a life that could not be left to die alone. Sometimes, late at night, she heard him moving carefully below. She never intervened. It seemed they both respected the invisible line that separated their lives, maintaining the silence that kept them safe. By May, the village had awakened again. People returned to their gardens and fields, yet talk of captured enemy pilots became common. Several German airmen who had crashed over the Channel were now being held in camps across southern England. For the locals, these were just pieces of news. For Elizabeth, they were warnings. She grew more cautious. At the hospital, she stayed longer hours to avoid being at home in daylight. The constant double life drained her strength. But discipline held her together. She knew any inconsistency could draw suspicion. Rumors said new patrols were coming to search for deserters or spies. At the end of the month, an officer once again visited homes, asking questions about strangers. Elizabeth was ready. She had cleaned everything, hidden all signs of medicine and food that did not belong to her. The inspection passed without incident. But in the cellar, time was running out. The man could not stay there forever. His presence had become too dangerous. Elizabeth began thinking of a way to help him escape. She remembered the small dock near Dungeness Point, where fishing boats sometimes moored at night. It was a quiet, half-forgotten place that few soldiers patrolled. She knew that if he reached the water, there was a slim chance he might cross the channel. Her plan was fragile, but it gave her purpose. Each day she collected small supplies, dry bread, a compass, clean bandages concealing them in a basket in the shed. Every step filled her with fear. She knew that one careless act could undo all she had done. Meanwhile, outside her private turmoil, the war moved on. Newspapers wrote about Allied advances in the Mediterranean and hinted at future victories. People smiled in the streets again, but Elizabeth could not share their optimism. For her, the end of the war meant exposure. When peace returned, secrets would no longer stay buried. By the end of May, the nights grew shorter and lighter. One evening, she opened her window to the soft sea air and heard the distant crash of waves. Everything seemed calm, too calm. She sensed that the quiet was only temporary. Something irreversible was approaching. The war, she knew, never truly stopped. It only changed its shape, taking refuge even in small, silent houses where compassion had become the most dangerous act of all. June 1943 came to southern England with strong winds. Gusts from the sea carried the scent of salt and seaweed, and thick fog hung over the coast. For most residents of Kent, it was just the usual weather. For Elizabeth Carroll, these days became the turning point. By now, the German pilot she had hidden for more than 4 months had fully recovered. His strength had returned, and keeping him any longer had become impossible. The authorities had intensified searches in coastal areas. After reports of enemy saboteurs, military patrols went from village to village, inspecting homes and barns. A neighbor mentioned that, in a nearby town, a woman had been arrested for sheltering a German prisoner. Since then, Elizabeth barely slept. Her life had turned into a waiting game. Every knock, every footstep near her door sounded like the beginning of the end. She understood that she could not hide him anymore. The only choice left was to help him leave England. The decision terrified her, but she saw no other way. In the evenings, returning from the hospital, she studied her old maps of the coast. One small spot caught her attention, an abandoned dock near Dungeness Point, a place once used by fishermen. It was quiet, rarely patrolled, hidden by dunes. If he could reach it unseen, there might be a chance to find a boat. By mid-June, she began preparing for the escape. Everything had to be done quietly, without witnesses. She packed a basket with a little food, a compass, a first aid kit, and a few dry bandages. One morning, before going to work, she carried it to the shed and covered it with rags. Every gesture filled her with dread. Even the smallest sound seemed too loud. She knew that one mistake could destroy everything she had risked. The night of the escape was cold and moonless. On 21 June 1943, clouds covered the sky, and the wind blew from the southeast, a good sign, masking their footsteps. They left the house after midnight. Elizabeth walked first, holding a lantern wrapped in cloth to dim its light. The pilot followed close behind, stooping low, avoiding the open stretches of road. They crossed fields, passed through hedgerows, then a narrow belt of woods. The distant roar of the sea grew stronger with every step. When they reached the shore, Elizabeth stopped. Ahead, faint in the mist, glimmered a small light, the reflection from a fishing boat moored at the old dock. She knew fishermen sometimes came there at night to check their nets. That night, the dock was empty. She placed the basket by the rusted winch, pointed toward the water, and stepped back. No words were exchanged. No thanks, no promises. Everything unfolded in silence, as if they both understood it could end only this way. She watched as the figure in the worn flight jacket disappeared into the fog. After a few moments, he was gone. For an instant, she thought she heard the faint splash of water. Maybe he had found a boat, or maybe he had only followed the coastline, hoping for a miracle. She stood still until the first light appeared on the horizon, then turned and walked back. At dawn, Selmond looked unchanged. Neighbors tended their gardens. The postman made his rounds. Gulls circled above the fields. Elizabeth entered her house, took off her coat, and sat by the fireplace. The cellar below was empty now, only damp air and the scent of ashes remained. For the first time in months, her home was truly quiet. Yet that silence did not bring peace. It carried the weight of everything that had been done and could never be spoken of again. July 1943 was hot and uneasy. The air over southern England was thick with the smell of salt and smoke. The war seemed to have shifted far away to Sicily, where Allied troops were advancing, yet in the quiet coastal villages of Kent, anxiety still hung in the air. People lived between news bulletins and short bursts of silence. It was during this uneasy summer that the investigation began, one that would change Elizabeth Carroll's life forever. A week after the German pilot's disappearance, an empty boat was found washed ashore. Inside were a flask of water and a torn piece of fabric from a Luftwaffe uniform. The discovery was made only a few miles from where Elizabeth had led him toward the sea. At first, no one paid much attention. The war often threw strange debris onto the beaches. But within days, a military unit arrived to examine possible escape routes for missing prisoners of war. British command feared that enemy pilots shot down over the channel might be receiving help from local civilians. Newspapers never reported it, but word spread quickly through the villages. Soldiers began questioning residents, checking identification papers, and inspecting barns and sheds. Women working in hospitals and supply depots drew particular attention. Officials believed they were more likely to show pity to the enemy. Elizabeth had expected this. In early July, she became even more cautious. She burned old papers, destroyed leftover bandages, and disposed of the medicine she had once smuggled home. Yet it was impossible to erase everything. Her life appeared normal, but the tension beneath that normality grew unbearable. On 12 July, a military officer arrived in Selmond. He introduced himself as Captain Williams and began inspecting the village. He asked about missing food supplies, about strangers seen near the roads. That afternoon, he knocked on Elizabeth's door. The inspection lasted only a few minutes. He looked around the small rooms, examined her documents, asked a few polite questions about her work schedule. She answered calmly, every word rehearsed in her mind. When he left, she noticed the way he glanced back at the house, a look not of suspicion, but of thought. The next day, at the hospital, she was summoned to the matron's office. Captain Williams was there again. He informed her that military intelligence had reports of an unidentified man in uniform seen in the area during April and May, and that someone might have helped him. Elizabeth listened without expression. She gave short, precise answers, her voice steady. When the questioning ended, the officer thanked her and left. From that moment, she knew she was being watched. New faces appeared on the village streets, men in uniform pretending to be telegraph workers or guards. Neighbors became cautious. One evening, walking home, she noticed a curtain quickly drawn in a nearby window as she passed. In a small village, silence could speak louder than words. The investigation continued for several weeks. Soldiers searched barns, abandoned mills, and empty houses. In late July, a small article appeared in the newspapers. Possible escape of German pilot from Kent coastline under investigation. Details unconfirmed. No names were mentioned, but Elizabeth understood. The chain of events was still following her. Several times she caught herself expecting the sound of boots at her door. Each knock, each voice outside made her heart race, yet no one came. She went on with her duties at the hospital, her composure unbroken. Only once, during a blackout, she stood by the window and saw a dark figure on the road. Rain blurred her vision. When she looked again, it was gone. But the feeling of being watched never left her. By the end of July, the search was quietly closed. There was not enough evidence to accuse anyone. The official report stated no confirmed civilian involvement. Elizabeth never learned whether the pilot had survived the crossing or drowned in the channel. Perhaps his body was lost to the sea, or perhaps he had reached his homeland. The uncertainty became part of her life, a silent continuation of everything she could never confess. She returned to her work, to the endless rhythm of hospital corridors and the muted world of post-war waiting. Outside, people smiled again. Letters came from soldiers returning home. But for Elizabeth, the war had never ended. It remained in the cellar of her memory, in the silence of her small house, proof that compassion, in a world ruled by fear, could be the most dangerous act of all. May 1945 brought victory to Britain. Radio broadcasts announced Germany's surrender, and the streets filled with songs and flags unseen since before the war. In villages, people lit bonfires, celebrated, and wrote letters to their loved ones, hoping they would soon return. At the Maidstone Hospital, where Elizabeth Carroll still worked, laughter echoed through the halls. Nurses tore down the blackout curtains, and patients stepped into the courtyard without fear. Yet inside Elizabeth, there was no celebration. The victory felt less like freedom and more like the silence that follows a storm. A silence in which she could hear only her own past. 2 years had passed since the spring of 1943, and life in Kent had changed. Most men had come home from the front. Women who had worked in hospitals and factories returned to domestic life. Elizabeth stayed at the hospital, even after she was offered a position in London. She could not leave the place where her secret had begun. Her house on the edge of Selmond still stood modest, a little crooked, its cellar sealed and never opened again. After the war, officials began to visit the countryside. Archivists, investigators, historians. They collected accounts about missing prisoners of war and possible escapes from Britain. In 1946, reports appeared about a few German pilots who had managed to cross the Channel. One man claimed that a British woman had helped him, though he never knew her name. His story appeared in a German newspaper and was later translated in London, but authorities dismissed it as fiction. It seemed too improbable. Yet for Elizabeth, it was enough. It was proof that the man she had hidden was alive. That thought brought a fragile sense of peace, though it was mixed with fear. She knew that any detail matching her story could draw unwanted attention, and so she remained silent. Her days passed in quiet repetition shifts at the hospital, letters from colleagues, evenings spent alone. She grew older unnoticed, her hair turning gray, her hands still steady. Sometimes, on calm evenings, she walked to the shore, the same stretch of beach where, in the fog, she had last seen the pilot disappear. The landscape had not changed. The wind, the stones, the endless gray sea. But now the sky was empty of aircraft. She stood there, watching the horizon, as if waiting for a sign. The past, in those moments, felt close enough to touch. In later years, the local newspaper wrote about her, a nurse who had served faithfully through the hardest years of the war. No mention was made of the secret she had carried. In official records, she was remembered as a woman of discipline and devotion. Only one small clue remained, a single line in her private diary without a date. Life cannot be divided into ours and theirs. Elizabeth Carroll died in 1961 at the age of 52. She was buried in a small cemetery near Selmond. In the hospital archives, her name appears beside a brief note of commendation. Exemplary service. No infractions. Her house stood for many years before it was demolished to make way for a new road. Decades later, researchers reviewing declassified wartime documents found mention of a German airman who had escaped across the Channel in June 1943. He had lived quietly in Hamburg as an engineer and died in the early 1960 seconds. Among his personal papers were a few handwritten lines in English. "I lived because one woman remembered that humanity matters more than war." He never recorded her name. This story never entered official histories. It remained between the lines, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest of times, compassion can survive where it is least expected.